Years later, we moved out. We were living in Willow Springs, which is part of what Ezra Hamilton had planned, I guess, as a resort, if I remember correctly. And that's on 90th Street. You go up Bozeman Boulevard and go north on 90th Street, and then you come to this little village of Willow Springs. And we lived out there later on for 3 years. I think at that time it was 1947, 48, 49, maybe 50. We were out there. And they were very blessed with artesian springs coming in on a pipe that was fitted into a swimming pool built in the side of the hill out of the natural rock from the fields there, and then the water flowed out and went down into an orchard, from what I remember. So we had this natural pool, which was absolute delight. That was at the west end of the village, and then there was a big pool toward the center of the village, and the children and the people from all around would come there and enjoy it. From what I remember, there was no charge, nothing. We just had everybody come and have a good time. I believe the Nelson family, Robert Nelson and his mom and dad, whose first names I don't remember, they were our landlords out there, and they put on barbecues. They had a tavern in the little town. It's still standing. All the buildings out there are made out of natural stone. And let's see, we used to close the tavern on Halloween night to just the people that lived there. And we had bobbing for apples, and many different games that they thought up. And it was just a fun time for everybody. There were a lot of Bell people out there too. Ruth and Dick Frost lived in the house around the corner from the tavern. Bob and Nell Anderson lived across the street, and they were the ones that collected the rent. And Nell kept the books, and Bob did all the repairs on the homes, the plumbing, the cesspools. Things would go wrong, and he was a handyman. They were both a wonderful couple. Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Sr. lived down in they all lived in Pasadena at that time, all the Nelson families, and they would just come up on the weekends. Then years later, they moved up permanently. People liked the little town, and the fact that it was so quiet, no street lights, very quaint place, and the houses they had out there were almost always rented. If you drive through today, there's a horse trough along the west side of the road on the way into town, into the little village, and it's been there since the Wells Fargo de Havilland stagecoaches went through there in the 1800s, late 1800s and early 1900s, I guess. And I think the Historical Society put up the lovely bronze plaque that stands beside it, and you can read that and get the proper dates from it. I believe one of the old gasoline pumps that you used to have to pull the lever and pump the gas up in there, and it was isinglass or something at the top. And I do believe it's still standing. There was one house out there called the Ice House, because years ago I understood that they actually cut blocks of ice somewhere and brought them and stored them in there for people who had ice boxes. if you can remember when you put ice in the ice box and then it melted and you had a hand underneath it, you would catch it, the water in, and hope you remember to empty it often. And that name stuck with that house. And I think Richard and Mary Payne, Dick and Mary Payne, rented that when we were out there in the late 40s. And let's see who was the other family. Oh, Sam Gray and his wife lived in the house behind the tavern. Sam loved to play his bass viol and entertained us. And one day it was so hot, I guess it made the strings pop, because I remember Mrs. Gray saying she heard this twang sound and they had split. That house has a wonderful porch that faces south, and you can see the whole valley. It's just a lovely place to live. And then the other house, where Bob Nelson now lives in the late 1900s with his wife Mary, I understood the banking family, the Giannini banking family, who started the Bank of America, had that built many, many years ago. It's a lovely old home. The bunkhouses are supposed to be still there when you go out and talk to the Nelson family. And Dolly Duntley's daughter, Mert, and her husband, I can't think of his name, first name, Mr. Davis, lived out there. And it was just a door and a room and a door and a room and a door and a room. Well, they opened them up all the way down so that Mert had a regular house to live in. And the first part was the kitchen, and the next section was the living room, and another section was the bedroom, and then there was a bathroom. And I believe her daughter, Ina Duntley Davis, was born while we were out there in the 40s. And she had another daughter named Sharon, a lovely girl. And I think later on in life, she had two boys who were named after Grandpa Duntley. One of the nice things about living out in Willow Springs, Nell Anderson and her husband had some horses and a corral, and once in a while, Nell would suggest that she and I go for a ride. Well, I never was a great horsewoman, but I thought I ought to give it a try out here in the wild desert. We didn't have to worry about any cars or anything. We just got on the horses and rode out in the desert. And the only problem, she said, was to watch out if you heard an airplane. Well, I couldn't figure out what she meant. But the pilots from Mojave, the Marine pilots, would be out flying. And if they saw you, she said, they often came down and buzzed you, which caused the horse to rear up. So we had learned to slide off real quick when we heard them and grab the bridle, because you didn't want to get dumped in the sagebrush. It was certainly a whole new ball game from when the girls used to go riding into New York on proper bridle paths. But that was the good part of being out here. It was so open and I don't know, just part of God's country. We used to take walks and in the evenings, and we ran across some steerheads, bleached. The bones were bleached white, but you could see the sockets where the eyes had been, and we brought those back and put them in the yard. It was something we certainly wouldn't have done in New York. And I think my first encounter with a snake, I wish I had known more about snakes, but I didn't. This one looked like large to me, and I thought it must be bad, so I got a shovel that had a square blade on it, and I remember going around to the outside because he'd come up on the porch of the house and literally slithered a little bit up the door, and I came up and whammed that shovel down right behind his head, and it astounded me that his body kept wriggling and wriggling and wriggling, but his head was stuck under my piece of my shovel. And after that wriggling stopped, then I picked it up with the shovel and threw it over the fence until Jack came home. I thought he'd be pleased, and of course I got quite a lecture because it was a king snake. And he said it was a good snake. Well, I didn't know there were any good snakes. And he said it would have kept the mice away and other snakes from the house. The house we lived in was at the west end of the village of Willow Springs, and we strung the clotheslines between the trees. And one time he brought home, and I guess it was an army issue that they'd gotten from surplus, and it was a tent that you rigged up, and it actually had ropes to hold it up so it looked like a little oblong cabin in a sense, and he loved to get in that, and he zipped it all the way around, and it had mosquito netting on it. Well, by that time, it was in the 40s, we'd had our children, John and Jim, and they were just little. Probably John was 4. He was born in 45. No, he'd been about 3, and the little guy was just a baby. So Jack had them in there with him one day on his chest, and for some reason or other they got to wriggling and the thing flipped upside down, but it was all zipped in, so there he hung saying help, and I thought they were fooling, and it took me a minute or two to get out there and try and upright them and get the zippers undone. But you just had to make your own fun. Swimming was the big thing out there because the weather was warm for so long. Both children learned to swim in this lovely round homemade pool out there. I guess that Mr. Hamilton must have had them built years before, and it was so wonderful to have this artesian spring putting the water in the north edge of it, and it ran out at the lower side and watered the orchard. The other pool, there were 3 in town. The huge big one that everybody used was at the east end of town. And then there was a private pool, a rectangular private pool up at what we called the big house, where the Giannini family had built it on the hill at the eastern end of the village. It looked out over the valley, and they had their own little pool, and it had a lovely water wheel, and the water flowed out of there, and when it touched the wheel, it made it keep going around. We have some pictures of that. A lovely place. We also would have barbecues out there due to Mr. Dudley's generosity. He had a lot of steers grazing in the hills, and I can remember the first time I ever saw one. He was split right down the stomach after he had been killed, and Mel Anderson took the brains of all things in and scrambled them with eggs for the fellows who were helping prepare the barbecue. And then the meat was cut up in, I think, about 10-pound chunks and put in salt bags. And then the salt bag was put into a burlap bag, and they were all separate chunks in there. And I think they were wet. They were wet down. And when they were ready, men had gone up and gathered a lot of the wood at Oak Creek, and oak wood was supposed to burn really well. They made a fire, and then they had collected big sort of flattish rocks, and they had the fire and had the rocks in there. The pit was already dug, and it had to be done in those days with a pickaxe and a shovel. But now I know that some of them do it with what would it be? Not a skip loader. I can't think what you would dig. But they dig the pit with a machine now. It's a lot easier. And then they put the hot rocks in the bottom of the pit in a layer of dirt, and then a layer of these wet burlap bags, and then another layer of dirt and hot rocks. And then they cover the whole thing up and leave it for 24 hours. And I think they used to try and have somebody stay awake and kind of keep an eye on things, because there are stories that sometimes people would come and dig that out. But it never happened to any of us when we had that done. And then Mr. Duntley would prepare beans, and we had beans and the meat, and I think we were making potato salad in the saloon, as we called it. It's still standing there. And we worked in there cooking things, and Raleigh made the beans in a great big wash tub, and he dug a trench and made a fire in the trench, and then just put this big galvanized tub over it and kept that going and cooked those beans all day long. I think he had to start probably the night before and cook those. And he certainly amused us when people would say how good they were. And he would talk about, they ought to be, I tore a board off the outhouse to stir them with, which made everybody laugh. Well, he was just teasing. And another thing he had was a sauce that he put on it, that he himself had the recipe for, and he had crocks, big crocks, maybe 5-gallon crocks. And he would order from the store the cans of tomatoes, and we had onions, raw onions, and he never wanted to tell us all what it was, but after helping for many barbecues, some of us went and wrote it down from memory. None of it was cooked, and Raleigh always wore khaki shirts clear down to here and a big cowboy hat. It was sort of a beige hat, but like a cowboy hat. And his face was very tanned, and his hands were very tanned, but he would roll up his sleeve, and he had washed his hands and everything, and then he would put his arm down in that crock and stir it all around with his hand in right up over his elbow practically. And when he took his arm out and sloshed off the tomatoes and what, his arm would be all red from all the spices and things that were in there. And it was a hot sauce. But, everybody enjoyed it. We had the meat and the hot sauce and the beans, and I think it was some kind of potato salad we worked on, because we prepared for this for 4 or 5 days ahead of time, getting stuff together and then getting it made. And it was totally free, and I have colored slides somewhere. It shows the long line of people you'd never laid eyes on before would come down out of the hills everywhere and line up in the town of Willow Springs and right through the main street and out to where the big pool was, where we had tables and things set up. And it was totally free, because he was a very generous gentleman, and that was put on once a year, but everybody pitched in and helped. I think Mr. Calandri had his onions. I'm not sure if it was that early, but anyway, we had a lot of people donated things, but he gave the steer and we fixed the meat. And that was the first time I'd ever had meat cooked that way. I guess that's the way the Indians did it years ago, but it's delicious. And to this day, there are many barbecues held in this area. I think that Mert Duntley's sons have a pit, a permanent pit in their backyard and we were out there. When she passed away, the family gave a barbecue for everyone that came to the services. That's a family that will never be forgotten. We have a park here in Lancaster named Raleigh Dudley Park near the college on Avenue K in his memory. We used to sit down around the edge of the swimming pool in Willow Springs because it was in a hollow area and we could get our backs up against the dirt, and we had a couple of people played guitars, and we would just sit there and in the evening and sing. And I wish I could remember the name of the man that played the guitar. He was a Basque gentleman, and he was here as a sheep herder for years. Very well known and liked. I cannot think at the moment, Jeff, of anything else I want to say about that part. Can we stop for a minute?
Sure.
Let's see what else.
This is up
at Burton's Camp, before they named it the Tropical Village. Glenn and Doreen settled, have a beautiful home on the hillside, and they like to travel, and they felt that they'd like somebody nearby that would kind of keep an eye on things, and they thought they would just level off a little piece of ground in front of their home, a little south and a little east of their own house. And from what I remember, as they were trying to level this off, they literally found another vein of gold. And so they followed it and dug into the hillside, and it made quite a tunnel, and then it petered out. So they had this level spot to put the trailer on for this lady who was going to come up there and live, and I believe her name was Julie Winslow. She told the story that she was happy to have this lovely, like a cavern tunnel in the side of the hill, because it was when we were fussing around with Castro at that time, and she called it her own personal air raid shelter. And she took the rubber tires off of this large trailer that she had put up there and stored them in this tunnel because it was cool, and she thought they would keep better. And she too had a lovely view from up there. Fortunately, many years went by, and when she passed away, later on, Glenn was having some problems with his eyesight, and Doreen was driving him here, there, and everywhere, and she thought it would be nice, if I have the story straight, that his brother come, who was retired, and they would put a big double-wide trailer home, mobile home, they don't like to be called trailer homes, up there, and it was done through the years. It was a bigger area leveled off, and that home was moved in, and June was her name. June settled, and I can't remember Glenn's brother's name. They lived there, and June became very active in the community and belonged to our Rosemond Women's Club, and she was a fine lady. And one time she had problems and had to come in to Antelope Valley Hospital and have some surgery, and I understand he had come in to visit her husband, and he had gone home that particular evening and taken some groceries with him because it was up on the side of the hill, and the best shopping was still in Lancaster at that time, and he always called her in the mornings to see how she was doing in the hospital, and sometimes he even called her in the evening when he left her and went home. But this particular night, June said he didn't call her in the evening, but she thought, well, he's probably tired. he'll call me in the morning. Well, he unfortunately didn't call, and she got a little worried and called out to the house and got no answer. So then she called to Doreen and Glenn, who were just a few hundred yards up the hill from her in their big home. And they went down, and sad to say, he, according to the coroner, must have walked in the house with the groceries and just dropped in his tracks. And then they had the sad task of telling June in the hospital what had happened to her husband. And I remember we went to a beautiful service for him. I think it was a Lutheran church in Lancaster. And dear June, having been in the hospital and having surgery, came in a lovely robe, and I think they pushed her in a wheelchair. But she was very brave, and all her family was there with her, and her sister-in-law, Doreen, settled, and then her brother-in-law, Glenn, were all there. Since then, for some reason, she has moved to Seattle, and that was in, I would say, in the 1980s, maybe. And since then, Glenn has been blessed to have his nephew, June's son, come and care for him in his later years, now in the 2002. So life goes on, and I know that Glenn has many, many happy memories, as we all do, of days out here. And we are happy that he has had his 96th birthday, is it? 90th birthday. Better not make him any older than he is. He always did our installations for our East Kern, is it East Kern Historical Society? And we always said he did the fastest installation of anybody. And it was always fun to have Glenn do that through the years. Unfortunately, since he's lost his dear wife, Doreen, to cancer, and his eyesight is not as good as it has been, he's chosen not to come, and we certainly miss him at our meetings. But we have pictures and slides and books. He has written many books, and some in conjunction with Doreen, and they are full of wonderful stories of life out here. I think the one I like was called When the Settlers Came, the Antelopes Left. And the sad part of it is, we used to buy those books for about $2.95, and now in 2002 they're $10 a piece.